I was sitting on a bench in the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The book in my hands was worn at the edges, the kind that had been read and reread too many times. It was one of those rare moments of peace, where the world faded away, leaving nothing but the printed words and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I felt it. That weight. That presence. I didn't need to look up to know someone was watching me. I had felt it too many times before, that creeping sensation of being observed, evaluated, and, inevitably, judged. Sure enough, when I finally glanced up, I saw him. Officer. Brian Harkins, mid-40s, stocky build, the kind of guy who had probably spent his entire career walking through neighborhoods like he owned them. His uniform was crisp, badge polished to an unnecessary shine, but it was his eyes that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just looking at me, he was hunting for something. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep reading, even as he made his approach. The sound of his boots on the pavement was slow, deliberate, a predator circling its prey. "Hey there," he said, voice carrying that forced casualness that never actually meant casual. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I didn't react at first because I knew the game. The moment I acknowledged him, I was playing by his rules, but I also knew ignoring him wasn't an option. So I shut the book slowly, keeping my movements controlled, no sudden gestures, no reason to give him an excuse. "What's the problem, officer?" Harkins gave me a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You match a description." There it was. The classic line. I exhaled through my nose, keeping my expression neutral. "Description of what?" His eyes flicked over me, scanning, evaluating. "Suspect involved in a robbery a few blocks from here," he said, tilting his head slightly, like he was waiting for me to slip up. "Dark hoodie, jeans, about your height." I looked down at myself. Plain black hoodie, jeans that could belong to half the city. "You mean I matched the description of half the guys walking around today," I said, my voice steady. Harkins' smile didn't waver, but I could see the way his fingers flexed near his belt, hovering just close enough to his holster to send a message. "Mind if I see some ID?" And there it was. I clenched my jaw, fighting the familiar frustration rising in my chest. I could already picture how this would go, how quickly things could escalate, how many times I had seen this play out before. But I also knew something else. Harkins thought he was in control. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I didn't move, not right away. Harkins was still standing there, waiting, his hand hovering just close enough to his holster to let me know exactly how this was going to go down if I didn't play my cards right. "Mind if I see some ID?" he repeated, his voice carrying that artificial patience, like he was doing me some kind of favor. I exhaled slowly, keeping my posture relaxed. The truth was, I did mind. A lot. "Am I being detained, officer?" The shift in his demeanor was instant. His jaw tensed, his eyes hardened, and just like that, the fake politeness disappeared. He wasn't expecting pushback. "I asked for your ID?" His tone sharpened, his stance shifting forward. "Hand it over." I kept my voice steady. "And I asked if I'm being detained." The tension between us thickened. I could feel people nearby slowing down, some stealing cautious glances in our direction. This was how it always started, a request disguised as an order. A man expected to comply because refusing meant escalation. Harkins' lips pressed into a thin line. His patience, if he had any to begin with, was gone. "You want to play that game?" he muttered, shaking his head like I was the one making things difficult. "Stand up, hands behind your back." I blinked. "For what?" His response was to reach for me. I barely had time to shift back before his hand clamped around my arm. The grip was tight, aggressive, not a request anymore, a demand. "You're resisting now?" he snapped, yanking me up from the bench. Twisted instinctively, trying to free myself, but before I could even get a word out, I felt the cold bite of metal against my wrists. The cuffs snapped into place, cutting into my skin. A few gasps echoed from the parkgoers who had stopped to watch, their curiosity quickly morphing into unease. "You're under arrest," Harkins muttered, shoving me forward. For what? I asked again, my voice sharper now. He didn't answer. Because he didn't have an answer. Because this wasn't about the law. This was about control. And as he marched me toward his squad car, I could feel it. The weight of every pair of eyes. Watching. Some shocked, some indifferent, some already looking away like they had seen this story before and knew how it ended. But Harkins didn't know. He had no idea, because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride to the station was silent, not because I had nothing to say, because I wanted Brian Harkins to sit in it. The tension, the unease, the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. I could see it in the way his hands clenched the steering wheel, the way his jaw kept tightening like he was chewing on something bitter. He expected me to panic, to plead, to demand answers. That's how these things usually went, right? But I just sat there, calm, quiet, watching him stew in his own arrogance, and that made him nervous. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in the windshield as we pulled into the station. Harkins yanked the car into park, exhaling sharply before turning to glare at me. "You think this is funny?" he muttered. I met his stare, unreadable. "I think this is unnecessary," his nostrils flared as he swung the door open. A moment. Later, my own door was yanked open and he grabbed my arm, hauling me out like I was some thug caught in the act. "This way," he barked, marching me inside, still cuffed. The moment we stepped into the station, the air changed, the low murmur of voices, the hum of office chatter, the clicking of keyboards. All of it came to a slow, unnatural halt, eyes turned toward us. At first, just casual glances, another arrest, another perp brought in off the street. Nothing unusual, then recognition started to settle in. It started with one officer near the front desk, his brows furrowed, his mouth parting slightly as he leaned forward in his chair. Then another, standing near the coffee machine, stiffened like someone had just poured ice water down his spine. A third, a sergeant, looked up from a stack of paperwork, and I caught the exact moment his face drained of color. "Marcus?" His voice barely carried, but it was enough. Harkins stopped walking. I felt the grip on my arm falter. Confusion flickered across his face as he looked between me and the growing number of officers suddenly whispering to each other. There. Expressions shifting from indifference to concern. "What?" Harkins started, but the sergeant was already moving, striding toward us with something between urgency and disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded. Harkins blinked. "Bringing in a suspect." The sergeant's eyes darted down to my cuffed wrists, then back up to Harkins, and something dangerous crept into his expression. "You just arrested a federal agent." Silence. Cold. Heavy. Suffocating. Harkins' grip finally loosened. I exhaled. Slowly, tilting my head slightly, just enough to see the way his confidence shattered in real time. Yeah? Now he knew. Harkins was silent now. The tough guy act had crumbled the second the sergeant said those words. "You just arrested a federal agent." But I let him sit in that silence, let him feel it clawing at the back of his throat. The murmurs in the station hadn't stopped. More officers were glancing our way, some whispering to each other, some just staring like they had just witnessed a car crash in slow motion. But no one stepped in, because they all wanted to see how this would play out. The sergeant wasted no time. "Take him to the captain's office. Now." Harkins didn't argue. He just nodded stiffly and led me down the hallway, his grip on my arm loose now, like he wasn't sure if he should still be touching me. We stopped in front of a door marked, "Captain Laura Bennett." He hesitated, then knocked once before pushing it open. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She barely looked up at first, flipping through a report in her. "Hands, what now, Harkins?" she muttered, sounding already exhausted. Then her gaze flicked to me. And just like that, the exhaustion disappeared. Her expression shifted in real time, from mild irritation to disbelief, then straight into something close to horror. "Marcus?" Gave her a small nod, my face unreadable. "Captain!" She shot up from her chair so fast it nearly tipped over. "Take those cuffs off him, now!" Harkins fumbled with the key, his hands shaking slightly. The second the cuffs clicked open, I rubbed my wrists slowly, letting the moment stretch. Bennett turned to Harkins, her voice dangerously calm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Harkins swallowed hard. "Captain, he didn't know," I interrupted. Bennett turned to me, searching my face. "You didn't tell him?" "No," I said simply. "I wanted to see how far he'd take it." The room went silent. Harkins' breathing was uneven now. I could feel the panic radiating off him. He knew, just like I knew, that his career might have ended the second he clicked those cuffs on me. Bennett exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Marcus, you could have called me. You didn't have to do this." I met her eyes. "But I did." Another heavy silence. And then I said the words that would stay with everyone in that room for a long time. If I wasn't FBI, how do you think this would have ended? Harkins stood there, frozen. The weight of what he had just done pressing down on him like an avalanche. I could see it in his eyes, the way the realization hit him in slow, agonizing waves. He had screwed up, badly. "Take those cuffs off him. Now." Captain Bennett's voice was sharp, slicing through the tension like a blade. Harkins fumbled with the key, his hands unsteady as he unlocked the cuffs and let them drop away. I rubbed my wrists slowly, watching him. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Bennett turned to him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable but unmistakably furious. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Harkins swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "Captain, Save it," she cut him off. "Do you realize how deep in it you are right now? You arrested a federal agent, without cause. You profiled him. You escalated without justification. And for what? Because he was reading a book in the park?" Harkins' jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. There was no point. The reality of the situation had hit him like a freight train. If I had been anyone else, if I hadn't been FBI, how would this have ended? How many times had it ended worse for someone who didn't have a badge to protect them? His breathing was unsteady now, his hands flexing like he wanted to defend himself, to explain, but he had nothing. No excuse that would hold up. No way to. Take it back, because it was already done. "You made a choice today," I said finally, my voice calm but deliberate. "You looked at me and decided I was a problem. You didn't see a man sitting on a bench reading a book. You saw what you wanted to see." Harkins flinched like I had physically hit him. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. "The difference between me and the people you usually do this to? I get to walk out of here." Silence. Harkins had no words, because there weren't any. Captain Bennett exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You're dismissed, Harkins. Go." He hesitated like he wanted to say something, anything. But in the end, he just nodded stiffly and turned, walking out of the office. Without another word, and just like that, it was over. But for him, this would never really be over. The fallout was swift. Within hours, an internal affairs investigation was launched. The department couldn't ignore this, not with my name attached to the report, not with Captain Bennett breathing down their necks, and definitely not with the footage, because the footage didn't lie. Harkins' body cam recorded every second of our interaction, from the moment he first spotted me sitting on that park bench to the way he approached me with suspicion dripping from his voice, the subtle hostility, the way his hand hovered near his holster, ready, expecting me to resist, and the worst part, his justification. You match the description. A vague excuse thrown out without hesitation. A phrase that had led to far. Too many wrongful arrests, too many lives upended, too many cases swept under the rug. But this time, there was no rug big enough to hide what he had done. The footage made it clear. He had seen a black man reading in the park and decided I was a problem. And now? Now, he was the problem. I sat in on the review meeting, watching from across the table as the IA officers replayed the footage. Harkins was there too, sitting stiffly, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He looked smaller than before, like the weight of his own actions was finally settling on his shoulders. When the video ended, the room was silent. Then one of the IA officers leaned forward, tapping a pen against his folder. "Officer Harkins, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Harkins swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was just following protocol," I scoffed under my breath. "Protocol?" Another officer shook his head. "Which protocol was that, exactly? The one where you approach someone without cause? The one where you escalate a situation with no evidence of a crime? Or the one where you arrest a federal agent without justification?" Silence. Harkins didn't answer, because there was no answer. The IA officer exhaled, flipping the folder shut. "This department has a problem, Officer Harkins, and today you became the face of it." And for the first time since this started, I saw it. The realization. The understanding that his career would never be the same again. The conference room was dead silent. Harkins sat at the long table, shoulders squared but face tight. He was trying to keep his composure, but I could see it. His breathing was uneven, his fingers twitching slightly as he clasped them together. On the table, he knew this wasn't going to end well for him. Across from him, the disciplinary review board sat with their files open, their pens ready, their expressions unreadable. Captain Bennett was there too, arms crossed, her face locked in stone. And then there was me. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, steady. "This isn't about me being FBI, Officer Harkins." Harkins blinked, looking at me for the first time since we walked in. "This is about what would have happened if I wasn't." His throat bobbed. He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. What if it was someone else? Someone who didn't have a badge to pull out at the last second? What? If it was a kid? A teenager just trying to get home? Would you have done the same thing? Harkins inhaled sharply, but he didn't answer. He couldn't, because we all knew the answer. One of the board members cleared his throat, tapping a folder in front of him. "Officer Harkins, you claimed you were following protocol. But after reviewing your body cam footage, it's clear that you escalated without probable cause. You detained a man without justification. And the only thing that stands out about Mr. Marcus here," he gestured toward me, "is that he was sitting in a park, minding his own business." Harkins exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "That wasn't my intent," I let out, a quiet laugh shaking my head. "Intent?" I repeated. "Your intent isn't what matters, Officer Harkins. It's the outcome." Silence settled over the room. One of the other board members leaned forward. "The truth is, Officer Harkins, this department cannot afford these kinds of mistakes. Not anymore." He sighed, flipping the folder closed. "Your record before this incident was acceptable. But this isn't something we can ignore." Harkins stiffened. "So what happens now?" The board exchanged glances before one of them answered, "Now? We decide whether or not you still have a badge by the end of the day, and for the first time since this started, I saw it. Fear." The decision came swiftly, effective immediately. "Officer Harkins is terminated from duty." The words landed like a hammer. Harkins sat there, unmoving. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He didn't argue, didn't lash out. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. Or maybe he had just run out of fight. The board members signed the final paperwork, and just like that, it was over. Or at least for him. For me, this wasn't over. Not even close. I exhaled slowly, straightening in my seat. "Firing him doesn't fix the problem," I said, my voice even but firm. The board members turned their attention to me, some raising their eyebrows in mild surprise. "I'm not saying Harkins shouldn't be held accountable," I continued. "He should. But if you think getting rid of one officer is going to change anything, you're lying to yourselves." Bennett studied me carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting, Marcus?" I leaned forward. "Reform. One of the board members scoffed. "We've heard that word before." "Then maybe it's time you start listening." Silence. I glanced at Harkins, who still hadn't moved. His career was over. That much was certain. But if the department thought this was just about him, they were missing the point. "This isn't just about a bad cop making a bad call," I said, looking around the room. "It's about the system that let him believe he could act without consequences. The system that trained him to see someone like me as a threat first, a person second." No one spoke. Good. That meant they were thinking. I don't want an apology. I don't want a press conference. I want real oversight, better training, more accountability, because if you don't start changing the way you police your own, this will keep happening. Captain Bennett met my eyes, nodding slightly. She knew I was right, and so did the board. One of the members cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing?" I exhaled. "A full review of training policies, bias evaluations, a real system of oversight, not just IA sweeping things under. The rug." I let my gaze sweep across the table. "And I don't mean in a year, I mean now." More silence. Then slowly Captain Bennett nodded. "Let's talk." Harkins had been handled. Now? Now it was time to fix the real problem. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started that day. The department initiated its first steps toward reform, bias training, stricter internal oversight, and a commitment to reevaluating how officers handled community interactions. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it damn sure wasn't fast enough. But it was movement, and movement was better than silence. I stood outside the station, inhaling the crisp evening air, letting it settle in my lungs. The tension that had weighed on my shoulders since the moment Harkins first approached me in that park had loosened just a little. Behind me, the department was trying to clean up its mess. In front of me, the city stretched wide and alive, full of people who would never know what had almost happened that day, who would never know how close one moment of unchecked power had come to altering my life. And that was why this fight mattered, not because of what happened to me, but because of what could have happened to someone else. As I walked toward my car, I felt the eyes of a few officers still lingering. Some looked wary, others thoughtful. A few, like Captain Bennett, nodded at me with something that almost resembled respect. It wasn't about being feared, it was about being heard. I opened my car door but hesitated before getting in. Maybe, just maybe, what happened today would be a turning point. Maybe the next time an officer saw a black man sitting in a park reading a book, they wouldn't see a suspect. They'd just see a man. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough.